As I mentioned earlier, students, it's really important that you've gone through the safety test of this machine and you have demonstrated competency back to the teacher before you're allowed to actually use this machine. A couple of things to remember when using the bandsaw. One, don't use it unless the teacher is actually in the room with you and you have asked permission to use the machine. That's really critical, as the teacher needs to make sure that you are safely operating this machine at all times. A couple of things that we need to do as far as the setup goes before we actually start to use the machine though. One of the things that we need to understand is what kind of material and what size material we're actually going to use. As you can see by this timber, it's 40 millimetres, which is quite thick, but it's perfect for what we're going to be doing on the bandsaw. This is the feet to a table that we make in Year 9 and 10. But it doesn't really matter what size material you use with this machine. You just need to make sure that the setup is the same all the time. Now, the first setup that we need to make sure with this machine is that the blade guard is covering the blade and is not too far above the piece of timber that we're going to use. The general rule of thumb for this is that the cover should be and these rollers down the bottom here, should be no higher than 10 to 15 millimetres above the surface of the timber. Now that's really important because generally your fingers are about 10 to 15 millimetres thick, depending if you're a young student in Year 7 or an older student in Year 12 who might have larger hands. So regardless of the size of your hands, the guard should be no greater than between 10 and 15 millimetres above the surface of the timber. Now there's a couple of adjustment knobs on this machine that you need to be aware of. The first one that we need to be aware of is this one on the side of the machine, and we need to unlock that. Now remembering everything that we use, left loosens a screw or a nut and right tightens. So we're going to loosen the nut on the side here, and that just allows the cover to move freely within this space. The second adjustment we're going to make is at the back of the machine, and that is this one here. And we're going to lower that again by turning to the left. And if we think in terms of our letters, again, lefty loosey, in this case, left is lower, okay? Right will raise the guard higher above the surface, and you can see that happening as I turn it to the right, okay? And again, when I turn it back to the left, you'll notice that guard comes down and lowers closer to the surface. Once we have done that, again, right to tight, okay? So we want to tighten that piece, that guard into place so it doesn't move while we're cutting. There's a couple of other things that we need to remember when we're using any of the machines, and that's to have a nice, strong, stable stance. Now, generally what I suggest is whenever we're using a machine, we want to be fairly square onto the machine. So that means our chest and our body is in line and facing that machine, that surface, that platform, whatever it is that we're using. We don't want to be side on. We don't want to be too side on from square, but we want to be mostly, where possible, square to that machine. Now, to get a nice stable stance means that generally we're getting ready for impact. So if you think of any of your sports, anything that you do in PE, you might have one foot forward to take an impact. And it's similar to when we're using the machines to create a nice stable stance. And part of this is because we don't know often what's going on behind us. So someone might bump us, and if we're standing flat-footed and square, we might actually fall forward. Where at least if we have one of our feet forward, and again, if you're left or right-handed, that might determine how you stand. I'm right-handed, so I generally have my left foot forward to brace for impact. I don't know if that's part of when I grew up playing football, whether that's just what I naturally did when I tackled someone. I don't know why I do that. I just know that generally my left foot is more forward than my right. So same when we're using this machine, you want to make sure that you are fairly square on, if not perfectly square on to the machine, and you want to have one foot slightly in front of the other. That will help us to be stable and ready to use this machine. As I said, the guard is above the surface. We are able to now use this machine safely. For the remainder of this video tutorial, I'm actually going to have the camera set up so that you can see the work surface a lot clearer. Okay students, before we get started, I just thought I'd explain to you a little bit about the surface of the machine and also again how to use the machine safely. Once I start the machine, it is going to get quite noisy, so you won't be able to hear what I'm actually saying. So that will be obviously displayed on the screen in text later on. A couple of things I just wanted to point out first was that I have a push stick on the machine. So generally I will have a push stick at the start of a project when I know that my fingers might get a little bit close to the surface that I'm trying to work. So it's important that I have my push stick ready at hand, ready to go when I start this machine. So I'm gonna place that next to the machine on the other side of the bed. I then have my piece of timber, and as I mentioned before, the piece of timber that I'm using at the moment already has some drawing on it. It's really important to remember that when we're doing any process, we need to indicate where the waste is, because we want to work on the waste side of any of our markings, because we can always come down to our pencil lines later. We want to try and leave our pencil lines on and nice and visible as possible. So remember, we always indicate our waste with an X, as you can see in the drawing, in the picture. And we're going to cut on the waste side. So along this cut, we're going to leave that line. We're going to cut that waste off. I'm going to come down and I'm going to cut this part of the waste out, and I'll show you how I do that on the machine. We're going to cut our straight lines first, then we're going to just chisel this bit of waste out later on, and you would have seen that in the production process. And then again, I'm going to cut this other angle. After I've done those cuts, I'm then going to come back and I'm going to cut the curve. Now it's really important that whenever we're cutting a curve, especially when it's an inside curve like this, okay, known as a concave, whenever we're cutting anything like this, it's really important that we remember that that curve will actually put stress on the blade on the bandsaw. Now, too much stress and the friction and heat that is caused by this process can actually make that blade snap. Now, that can be, generally, it's a fairly safe process when that snaps because of the guards that are in place, the covers that are all in place. But every now and then it can go wrong. So you just need to remember to put as little pressure on that blade as possible, and we don't want the blade to twist, because that's when the friction and then the snap will happen. So to cut this curve, I'm going to show how to do that after I've done the straight cuts. So as I said, I'm about to turn the machine on. It's going to get quite loud, so I want you to really focus on a couple of things. I want you to watch where my fingers and my hands are placed at all times. I also want you to watch how I use the push stick in relation to my piece of timber. So again, nice stable. Okay, so you'll notice that I have now made those first two straight angled cuts. I've also gone through and cut those straight lines down to my pencil mark so that I can come back and chisel that out later on. The next step, as I said, that we're going to do is cut this curve. Now there are two ways that we can cut this curve. So we can take our time how we cut inside that concave shape. The way that I'm going to show you though that places as least stress as possible on the blade is that we're going to make a series of straight cuts through the timber towards those curves. Now again, remember, do not go into your good side, so stay within the waist area indicated by the X at all times. We can use another machine, so we can use the large belt sander to sand down to that pencil line and follow that curve. There is no need to cut to the line. We can use another machine to get down to that line later on. You will notice now that I've made those relief cuts straight up towards where my pencil line is placed. Now the benefit of doing these lines is that it's actually going to release some of that stress and pressure that is placed on the blade. That's why I've gone up close to those pencil lines, and you're going to see as I cut through this, each one of those little bits of timber are going to fall away from the main part of the timber and they're going to be left behind. Obviously with all of our offcuts that we create, they go straight into the garbage bin. Okay, I'm now going to show you how I do that curved cut after I've made those initial relief cuts. Okay, you'll notice now that the bandsaw is finished and I move that piece of timber away, it leaves those bits of offcut behind. And you'll see that what's actually been created is you can see that curve that I've started to do. All of those little bits of timber are all individual. So again, once you've done that, you can place those straight into your recycling bin. Okay, you'll notice that now, now that I've made that initial cut, we have that nice curve. Again, it's fairly bumpy. It's not quite nice and smooth like we want it to be, but we're going to go and finish that on another machine in a minute. I'm going to show how to do the rest of this cut. So we're going to cut through that straight, and then we're going to come back down the other side and finish that curve off. Again, remembering the principle of keeping your hands and fingers well away from that blade. And any time that you feel like you need to, remember to use the push stick. So starting the bandsaw with the timber close but not touching. So I've completed that cut now, the bandsaw has been turned off, and I can safely remove any of that waste to the rubbish bin. You would have noticed that throughout that process I kept moving my hand in relation to the blade. Okay, so that's now fully complete. You would have noticed that I kept moving my hand as I was getting close to the blade. So at no point was my hand any closer than 5 centimetres from the blade, because that's what I deem sort of safe. I don't want to be anywhere near the blade. I don't want my fingers to be any closer than the length of the actual finger to the blade. When I'm pushing past, I'm constantly adjusting my hands. My right hand is generally the one that's pushing. My left hand stays fairly stable and connected to the table. I generally don't move my left hand. It stays fixed, pretty much fixed to the table, and I use my thumb and fingers to guide and push. Then I'll use my right hand to guide and push, and I'll come through past. So at the moment the saw is off, so this is a safe process to use. But I'll move past the blade, and again, generally about 10 centimetres, or I use again this trench that is on the bandsaw as a guide to say, okay, well that's my safe zone. As long as I don't go too close inside that space, I'm going to be safe. So when I'm moving past, I'll move my hand outside that space, grab the other side of the timber there that you can see here, and I'll pull and push with my left hand through and past that blade, so that again my fingers aren't too close to the cutting surface at any time.